What about those from North? Bob Stewart, did you know him, or he's on there?
Knew him, didn't really meet him, Bob Stewart.
Okay. Who were those who was on the lineup when you were broadcasting, Mark?
Oh, there was Tom Lodge.
We've got people who were listening at the time. We heard from Christina remembers you, Mark, and Sandy in Bolton also remembered you. Who were the ones that broadcast around you, just so we can prompt others to call in with memories?
Gosh, there was Tom Lodge, Carl Englander. Do you know, I really can't. Micah Hearn was there.
But have you kept in contact with them since?
Keep in contact with Carl England occasionally.
Yeah?
Yeah. Tom Lodge was still trying to get hold of. He's in Australia now. He's a sheep farmer.
Wow.
He's got a huge farm in Australia somewhere. So we're seeing if he'll come to the 50th.
What will be happening on the 50th celebrations?
These old men that we are now will be sort of running a disco. But people won't be able to miss us because we'll have our mobility scooters outside. We go faster stripes and twin air horns.
Because you surprised me when you asked me to guess your age, and I assumed 60s, but then 71, which I suppose you'll all be in your 70s, given the times.
We're all dodderers now, all of us.
You look remarkably well for your age.
That's because I'm teetotal.
You've never drunk, and you've said you'd never tried drugs.
Never, ever, ever.
Which just brings me on to the scene that was at Radio Caroline. In the times you were on board, was it not a raucous lifestyle?
No. Absolutely not. It wasn't allowed. You were not allowed alcohol on board at all. You were at Christmas. They sent a couple of bottles or whatever, but alcohol was forbidden on board. Obviously, alcohol, men, or boys as we were, young men, in a confined space, doesn't bode well. So alcohol was absolutely forbidden.
On the phone now, BBC Radio Lancashire and Manchester listeners, very familiar voice for you next, Paul Roelly, who, to some, will be a BBC politics correspondent. If you're listening to BBC Radio Manchester early, you'll have heard his great commentary on Wigan's game, because he is an absolute Wigan fanatic. But Paul, a complete radio anorak, because you are a living, walking history on Radio Caroline as well, aren't you, Paul?
I did a documentary 5 years ago, broadcast by both Radio Lancashire and Radio Manchester, called The Other Radio Caroline, which is all about Radio Caroline North. And I'm pleased to say, Alison, it won a Frank Gillard Award for Original Journalism.
Another one?
Yeah, another one. And I've done a lot of documentaries about radio. I've been in the industry for 40 years, and I was fascinated by Mark's recollections, or not in certain respects, because I have to tell you, Mark, I know every disc jockey who was on Radio Caroline North. You just mentioned Tom Lodge. I have to tell you, Tom Lodge died last year. You mentioned Micah Hearn, and Micah Hearn died 3 years ago. I knew these people, and I have to tell you, Mark, I've never heard of you.
Right.
You weren't on Caroline North, were you?
Yes, I was.
From when to when?
65 to 67.
What happened in 67 that you left?
How do you mean?
Why did you leave in 1967?
Because Caroline was closed down.
When was it closed down?
Oh, gosh, that will be...
The Marine Fences Bill came into effect on August the 14th, 1967, which outlawed the pirates. Is that when it closed down?
No, it was after that. It was after that.
So when did it close down, and why did it close down?
Well, it closed down because the Marine and Broadcasting Offences Act came in, and they closed us, and we were, well, the people who were on board at the time were taken off, basically.
And did you stay on board after the Marine Fences Act was passed?
Yes.
So you stayed on the air till when?
Until 2 weeks before it closed.
2 weeks before it closed,
yes.
Right. You see, I've written this definitive history of Radio Caroline North. A friend of mine, John Meyer, has written the most definitive history of pirate radio. Keith Skews, who I was talking to only yesterday, has written the best book about pirate radio, Pop Go the Pirates, and none of us have ever heard of you. I think you're a phony. I think you're a fake. I don't think you were ever on Radio Caroline.
Wow.
Well, I was.
What?
There's no recollection of you on any website.
Well, I don't do
think
websites.
you may be a radio fan, but your memories are very hazy. You talked about Kenny Everett. Kenny Everett was never on Radio Caroline, North or South.
No, we didn't say that, Paul. We were talking about memories earlier of Kenny Everett, and it was the one that everybody has, and that was made clear. But Mark, what would you say to Paul, who is an absolute encyclopedic walking history of the station? And as we've been talking, I mean, we've had a couple of listeners who said they could remember you, whether it's because you're here talking, or I'm just trying to look for concrete evidence now of your presence on Radio Caroline North. What would you say to Paul?
I was there.
You mentioned, what disc jockeys were you on air with at the time then?
There was Tom Lodge.
And
Carl England.
There's no Carl England. There was Steve England, who was a who was on Caroline in the 70s, or Atlanta in the 70s. There was Carl Conway. Carl Conway, not Carl England.
No, this was Carl England. Definitely Carl England.
Right, apart from Tom Lodge and this person, Carl England, who else were you on the radio with?
That's mainly who I can remember.
You've not got a very good memory, Mark.
No.
And I would put it to you, I don't think you were ever on Radio Caroline.
I certainly was. Most certainly was.
You have no documentation left, though. You say you've none of your scrapbooks left, you've none of your photos left.
None, but I can get them. I'll find them. I will find them.
You see, Caroline North continued, Caroline South continued. If you were on board when the Marine Offences Act came into force, how did you get to the ship off the Isle of Man?
We were taken by tender.
To where?
How do you mean to where?
How were you taken by tender? Where were you taken from by tender?
Quite a lot of the times they came from Holland. Or you made your way to the Isle of Man and...
No, you couldn't, because the Marine Offences Act was passed. It was unlawful for anybody to work for, supply, or advertise on the station.
It was.
And they went through another country, and the other country was the Republic of Ireland, because I've spoken to people like Mark Sloan and Martin Kane and the late Daffy Don Allen and people who were involved in Caroline North. I put it to you, Mark, you were not involved.
I'm sorry, but I was.
Nobody can give you any authenticity that you were involved. You can't give me even names of people you were on other than the legendary Tom Lodge.
Yes, Tom Lodge, yeah.
Who's dead? Michael Hearn
I didn't
dead.
even know he'd passed away, to be quite honest.
Yeah, and you said you never met Bob Stewart?
I've never met Bob Stewart.
Well, the funny thing is Bob Stewart was on Caroline North from the entire 65 and 66. So if you were on air at that time, it was very difficult to miss the guy who broadcast every weekday from 12 till 3. So again, I put it to you, Mark, I don't think you're for real. And I put this to you as somebody who's been a journalist for 40 years and have worked in broadcasting throughout that time.
Well, I'm sorry, but I was. Absolutely.
I rest my case, Alison.
All right, Paul, really appreciate your call. Fascinating how we're going to resolve this, because, Mark, you're sitting there, you're not blushing, you're not angry.
No.
Your response is quite interesting. Are you going to be able to find these scrapbooks in your loft, do you think, to be able to verify?
They're not in my loft, but I will find them. And I will come back and prove it. Absolutely, I will.
How astounded are you by Paul's assertions? Who is...
I've heard it before.
With? I mean, he can't be the first one. I've been asking you questions through the programme that have, to be fair, some of your memories are hazy. A lot of your memories are hazy. And when we go for the specifics, there isn't a lot of detail there, Mark. And having spoken for the last hour or so, you must have had it put to you on previous occasions that your memories are reasonably vague of such a momentous job that you once had?
Absolutely. And it's been said that we weren't there, but we were.
Well, it's not we, it's you.
Well, me. Yes, if you like. Yes, I was there.
Those people that offered you the job at Red Rose Radio, could they remember you from your Radio Caroline days,
No.
Mark?
No. No, they had no idea.
So what on basis were they offering you the job?
I was actually helping a taxi company out on a Sunday. And I was on the radio, if you like, talking. And one of the customers was the director. They worked at Manchester Airport or something. And heard me.
I heard you where?
Heard me on the radio.
What radio?
Taxi radio.
Oh.
At the time.
And someone offered you a job on Red Rose Radio on the strength of hearing you on a taxi radio?
Asked who I was. Yep, that's quite literally how it happened, yeah.
Mark, now that to me I find quite unbelievable.
It's true. It's true. That was in 80... That would be 85.
How are we? How are we?
Something like that.
How are you going to prove now that you worked on Radio Caroline? Because that assertion that you were offered a job on a commercial radio station in Preston in the 80s when people were fighting tooth and claw for jobs, that you were offered a DJ's job on the strength of someone hearing you on a taxi radio. I'll have to say, having worked in radio for 30 years, is quite unbelievable.
It's true. Absolutely true. It's totally true, that. And I turned that down, but I was with Radio Caroline. And yes, I was a fan. And
Are you sure you're not just such a massive fan that somehow memories have got confused?
No, absolutely not.
Is a psychologist, so it'd be interesting also to get her take on what I want to start with tonight, because we're going to begin where we left off on Thursday night. What guest could we have had on that would prompt a BBC correspondent to ring in and say this?
None of us have ever heard of you. I think you're a phony. I think you're a fake. I don't think you were ever on Radio Caroline.
More from Paul's call later on, but if you were with us on Thursday, you will have heard Mark Dean, who'd come in to reminisce about his days as a DJ with Radio Caroline in the 1960s. Now, we'd come across Mark after we'd contacted the show a couple of times to talk about pop music history, and through conversations we had on air, he mentioned his work on Radio Caroline. Now, despite previous callers, and there were some on Thursday saying they'd recalled Mark on air, it became apparent that some of Mark's memories were somewhat hazy. Now, I'm going to play you now some snippets garnered from our chat on Thursday night as I asked him to reflect on his days with a radio station at the heart of a radio revolution. Now, believe me, listening to this makes my head scream. It's like dragging your nails down a chalkboard as I wait for answers that quite clearly, some way into the interview, were never going to come. Any pauses you hear are quite genuine, and in some cases, for the sake of us having to move in, have actually been made shorter. But on Thursday, I was beginning to get cross that Mark thought he could get away with such vague responses.
I don't think there were many big names on Radio Caroline North. It was mainly South. Micah Hearn.
Bob Stewart.
Baby Bob Stewart. Yeah, I never met Bob Stewart, but heard about him many times.
What slot did you have?
They moved you around, so you were used to every sort of time.
What was your particular favourite shift?
Afternoon, probably.
And you sit in this studio now, Mark, and describing this as complete luxury. What were your studios like on the ship?
Like a cardboard box, really. Very, very tiny studios. You couldn't get two people in sideways together. Very, very long, but very narrow, if you know what I mean.
And to be on board ship, just explain what the living conditions were like.
Very cramped. But the atmosphere was great. You know, we all... great camaraderie.
And how long a time did you spend on board before you got shore leave?
You would do... It came in 2 sections. You would do 2 weeks on, 2 weeks off. And then 3 weeks on, 1 week off. But the 2 weeks you did on and the 2 weeks you did off, on that time you were off, that wasn't meant as your time. You would go around doing different things, promoting Caroline all the time.
Mel Francis, evening to you on Twitter. He said, oh, Mark Dean, he says, I used to know all the boys from both Radio Carolines, more from the northern one. But having seen his picture, you just said now he's aging a bit, so you don't quite recognise him, do you?
No.
You don't recognise the name Mel Francis?
No.
Are you still in touch with many of the old names?
A couple of them.
Who was on the lineup when you were broadcasting, Mark?
Oh, there was Tom Lodge.
Who were the ones that broadcast around you, just so we can prompt others to call in with memories?
Gosh, there was Tom Lodge, Carl England. Do you know, I really can't. Micah Hearn was there.
But have you kept in contact with them since?
Keep in contact with Carl England occasionally. Tom Lodge was still trying to get hold of. He's in Australia now. He's a sheep farmer. He's got a huge farm in Australia somewhere.
More on that in just a second. But not only could Mark recall who he'd worked with, he couldn't recall the big names that he'd actually interviewed.
Oh, gosh. I've interviewed Gene Pitney.
Where at?
I've interviewed Gene Pitney in Southport, Liverpool, Ireland, and I can't honestly remember where else.
We then got a call which brought things to a head, which we will return to after this.
Oh, yes, I'm the great pretender, pretending that you're still
Great Pretender by the Platters. We are talking tonight about Walter Mitty characters and asking you what the most elaborate lie is that you have ever heard or been told. Let us know, 81333 if you're texting in. Start your message with the word late. You can give us a call, 01254 583 583. We're on Twitter. Kevin Murray says on Twitter, Alison, the Radio Caroline DJ from the other night was a beauty. Continuing with Mark's visit to the station, to the Late Show on Thursday night. The call that brought things to a head, well, it came from a familiar voice to listeners of Radio Manchester and Radio Lancashire. Paul Roelly is a political correspondent by day, but also an avid Wigan fan, so does football commentary for BBC Radio Manchester. He's also won awards for the definitive documentary he made last year, charting the history of Radio Caroline.
I did a documentary 5 years ago, broadcast by both Radio Lancashire and Radio Manchester, called The Other Radio Caroline, which is all about Radio Caroline North. And I'm pleased to say, Alison, it won a Frank Gillard Award for original journalism.
Another one.
Yeah, another one. And I've done a lot of documentaries about radio. I've been in the industry for 40 years, and I was fascinated by Mark's recollections, or not in certain respects, because I have to tell you, Mark, I know every disc jockey who was on Radio Caroline North. You just mentioned Tom Lodge. I have to tell you, Tom Lodge died last year. You mentioned Micah Hearn, and Micah Hearn died 3 years ago. I knew these people, and I have to tell you, Mark, I've never heard of you.
Right.
You weren't on Caroline North, were you?
Yes, I was.
From when till when?
65 to 67.
What happened in 67 that you left?
How do you mean?
Why did you leave in 1967?
Because Caroline was closed down.
When was it closed down?
Oh, gosh, that will be...
The Marine Fences Bill came into effect on August the 14th, 1967, which outlawed the pirates. Is that when it closed down?
No, it was after that. It was after that.
So when did it close down, and why did it close down?
Well, it closed down because the Marine and Broadcasting Offences Act came in, and they closed us, and we were, well, the people who were on board at the time were taken off, basically.
And did you stay on board after the Marine Offences Act was passed?
Yes.
So you stayed on the air till when?
Until 2 weeks before it closed.
2 weeks before it closed,
yes.
Right. You see, I've written this definitive history of Radio Caroline North. A friend of mine, John Meyer, has written the most definitive history of pirate radio. Keith Skews, who I was talking to only yesterday, has written the best book about pirate radio, Pop Go the Pirates, and none of us have ever heard of you. I think you're a phony. I think you're a fake. I don't think you were ever on Radio Caroline.
Wow.
Well, I was.
There's no recollection of you on any website.
Well, I don't do websites.
I think you may be a radio fan, but your memories are very hazy. You talked about Kenny Everett. Kenny Everett was never on Radio Caroline, North or South.
Mark, what would you say to Paul, who is an absolute encyclopedic walking history of the station? And as we've been talking, I mean, we've had a couple of listeners who said they could remember you, whether it's because you're here talking, or I'm just trying to look for concrete evidence now of your presence on Radio Caroline North. What would you say to Paul?
I was there.
You mentioned, what disc jockeys were you on air with at the time then?
There was Tom Lodge.
And
Carl England.
There's no Carl England. There was Steve England, who was a disc jockey, who was on Caroline in the 70s, or Atlanta in the 70s. There was Carl Conway. Carl Conway, not Carl England.
No, this was Carl England. Definitely Carl England.
Right, apart from Tom Lodge and this person, Carl England, who else were you on the radio with?
That's mainly who I can remember.
You've not got a very good memory, Mark.
No.
And I would put it to you, I don't think you were ever on Radio Caroline.
I certainly was. Most certainly was.
You have no documentation left, though, you say. You've none of your scrapbooks left. You've none of your photos left.
None, but I can get them. I'll find them. I will find them.
Astonishing there, because Mark Dean stood by his story and left the studio 10 to 15 minutes after that on-air chat. We will come later on to other conversations we had on air before he left. Absolutely adamant that he says he is who he said he was all through the interview, but various message boards have been alight over the weekend on the internet and social networks. I have tried calling Mark today. I've left texts, voicemails, called him not an hour ago, oddly enough, to no response whatsoever. But also, various other emails have come in over the weekend. For instance, Brian Cullen says, I was a Radio Caroline North listener and I've been in radio for 40 years, having got the radio bug. Used to work with Paul Roelly at Radio City in Liverpool. Paul Roelly, you've just heard there. This guy's making it all up. Yes, maybe a fan, as you said, but he has nothing to do with Caroline North. Colin Wilkins emails Alison.Butterworth at bbc.co.uk. I've just listened to your Thursday programme and your interview with Mark Dean, who claims to have been on Radio Caroline North. He's just a dreamist. How could someone not have photographs of their time on Caroline? I have hundreds of recordings, but nothing of Mark Dean. He couldn't even answer your questions without umming and ahhing. It'd be interesting to know if he's found the photographs he's supposed to have. John Bennett says, I'm listening to your excerpt from Thursday night's programme. A few thoughts spring to mind. Tom Lodge, sadly deceased, didn't live in Australia. Neither did he run a sheep farm. You've just heard Mark Dean saying that he did. He was transferred to Caroline South in 1965 in an effort to bring the programmes of Caroline South up to standard. He says, Carl England, well, Steve England worked on Caroline in the 70s. I can tell you that Carl England worked on the road show that Mark Dean did work on. But another email came in from Tom Edwards, who was very definitely on board Radio Caroline South from 1965, after a time with Pirate Station, then Radio City. And Tom joins us now. Tom, good evening.
Hello, Alison. Greetings from Heckington, Lincolnshire. Hello, Lancashire.
Thank you. And to Greater Manchester as well, Tom.
And Greater Manchester.
Recollections from Mark, just a little bit hazy. I think yours will be a bit clearer.
Well, I tell you what, I want to give Paul Roelly when I next meet him. I don't think Paul and I have met in the past, but I'd like to give him a high five. And I must confess, Alison, that I squirmed listening into your program on Thursday evening because the man was obviously lying. How soon, I've got to ask you a question for a change, how soon did you realise that maybe he was giving out a false identity?
Pretty soon. I had reservations from the start. We started the interview around about 5 to 11, but with callers and things, time passes with records that you played. To get into the interview proper, it was about 25 past 11 when I started asking questions in earnest and got exceedingly vague answers. All my alarm bells were ringing. And so then, as you will hear a little bit later on, because I'm going to drop in bits and bobs, people were posting things, and no matter what recollections people had, unfortunately, Mark couldn't recall any of the same stuff, didn't recall faces, couldn't remember who he worked with, couldn't recall, the great names that he'd supposed to have interviewed, and left it to Paul, really, because Paul Roelly was in contact with me via email, and he is the definitive history of Radio Caroline.
Yes, he is, together with Keith Skews, who Paul mentioned has written a beautiful book.
So I took the decision then, put Paul on air, and let's sort it out now. But what is astonishing, in 25 years of live broadcasting, Tom, never have I met with someone who was so adamant that what they were saying was true, when in the face of it, so many people were saying it wasn't.
I know, and at first I was quite angry, and I started to squirm in my seat here at home. And then tonight I'm quite sad that somebody will want to lie about being a disc jockey on Radio Caroline. If he was a fan of Radio Caroline and wanted to talk to you as an interviewer about those days, fair enough. But he was, of course, never a disc jockey on Caroline North. And I have to say that he's upset a lot of friends of mine who we call anoraks. These are people from both far and near around the world who know more about pirate radio than I can remember, and I was actually there. So hi to all the anoraks from John O'Groats to Land's End
and what's great
around
about
the globe.
it, Tom,
and they're listening in to you tonight, Alison.
Well, that's good, and I hope they stay with us. And what is so great about the Late Show Gang, because we do spread far and wider, and people are listening on the internet, so far wider than just the Northwest. And for instance, Paul, very accessible to the programme, emailed in, and we sorted it out, as soon as we thought we're just going to nail this guy. He's not going to come on live radio thinking that he can get away with telling a story and a history that quite clearly isn't cracked up what it's going to be. But we are going to talk very shortly to a psychologist who specialises in men's mental welfare. So we will talk about all that very shortly. But what I thought with you, Tom, is just to paint a clearer picture. You were on South, not North.
Right.
But the days that we were talking about with Mark Dean, it just became so incredulous listening to him paint this picture that seemed to let us think he was living the life of a Trappist monk on board.
I know. I must confess that I didn't know much about Caroline North. I met Mike Ahern, who sadly is no longer with us because he came from the North Ship to the South Ship, a very popular disc jockey. And I didn't meet most of the DJs. I mean, the DJs that I knew on Radio Caroline South were Roger Twiggy Day. Hello, Roger, listening down there in Kent. People like Johnny Walker, Steve Young, who's probably listening over there in Canada. And we became good mates. And actually, the gentleman that you did have on Thursday night, if Mark Dean is his correct name, the camaraderie was very good, because you've got to be a very good mixer to be on a ship for 2 weeks out of 3. Again, he was wrong about the roster. We did 2 weeks on the ship, 1 week off.
Yeah, you've been quoted as saying that on the Mi Amigo, relations between DJs and crew could be fraught. Mark Dean...
Oh, they could, because sometimes all the crew were Dutch, Alison, and sometimes they would serve up the same dish with a load of rice, all this Indonesian food. And I can remember that 1 or 2 people got a little bit iffy about the same dish day after day. But you had to be a darn good mixer on the Mi Amigo.
Yeah. And Mark Dean, which isn't his real name, we've been told his real name is Malcolm. And the other thing that I was quite incredulous about, not only was he saying that he was teetotal and lived this very clean life, and that could be the reason why he looked so young at 71.
Right.
I am told he's actually about 57 years old.
Okay.
He did help out with the original Caroline North Roadshow for about a year, driving the van and moving equipment. I am still waiting to hear from Mark to see if he is willing to confess his true situation.
Well, he certainly had more than his 5
tell
minutes
his own
of
story.
fame, Alison.
Absolutely, and let me tell you that he paid quite dearly to come on, because we offered no expenses to come on to BBC Radio. There was no assistance in getting him here, and I can tell you that his cab fare was quite substantial, because he travelled in from West Lancashire. He said he was going to bring scrapbooks, but instead presented us with boxes of chocolates. So it was no slight expense that he incurred in coming here. His story about why he was offered a job on a Preston commercial radio station from
that was via the taxi firm, wasn't it?
a director in the backseat of a cab, having heard him on a taxi radio, then actually had me saying, well, I'm sorry, but
That
any
is
credibility
bizarre.
is just gone. And I don't know why he would say that. But just to focus on the days that you did have on Caroline, because I was asking him about, surely, you know, with the you must have had the followers, given that sailors over in the Isle of Man used to bring hordes of sightseers over and day trippers round the boat. And I've seen you pictured almost in pop star status with girls around you wanting your autograph. It must have been an
it was
absolute
amazing,
hoot.
especially during the summer months, because flotilla of ships would come out. I mean, very quick-thinking fishermen would get their fishing smacks ready to escort all these young girls across the North Sea. We were, a few miles out of the out to sea, about 6 or 7 miles. So these girls would come out and meet the guys that they listened to all day and all night. And sometimes the girls were allowed on board the ship. Maybe I shouldn't say this if the captain was looking the other way. That's between you and I, Alison.
Where there's a will, there's a way. Well, if you were here, Tom, I'd just ask you to sign my bottom in felt
It's a
coat.
deal. You sound a fun girl.
I'll tell you what, you could write a few pages the size of my bum, Tom.
Don't say that.
50 years next spring.
It
Big
is next
anniversary being
Easter.
celebrated.
It's a big celebration. The 50th anniversary of Radio Caroline first being heard. Incidentally, the shipwreck of the Mi Amigo, somebody's just messaged me that there was a program on BBC 4 tonight, which is all about shipwrecks, Britain's sunken history. And I believe there's some footage of the sunken Mi Amigo, which, of course, was Radio Caroline South. So that was on BBC 4 earlier tonight. I think it's repeated later in the week. But a big 50th anniversary. The BBC are planning something that I do know, but the powers that be have told me I'm not to say a word about it until it's all organised. But something is being planned for the 50th anniversary, and hopefully we may meet up at that time, Alison.
It would be great too. Certainly we'll discuss it in more detail as well. Tom Edwards, thanks for your time tonight.
It's my pleasure, Alison.
And
Have a good show.
Do me a favour, just from a DJ of 50 years standing, Tom, if you introduce the fortunes for us.
Well, I would love to do this. This is a record that we played on Radio City if we had a problem out on the Shivering Sands forts. And no mobile phones in those days, Alison. So if we had a problem running short of water, food, or somebody was ill, this was the record to our friends on shore in Whitstable, which is the Fortunes, and You've Got Your Troubles.
Good to speak to you, Tom.
Thank you, Alison.
Take care.
Cheers.
So come on, the most elaborate lie you've ever been told. They're coming in. 81333. Start your text with the word late. Give us a call. 01254 583 583.
I see that worried look upon your face. I've got
Fortunes with You've Got Your Troubles, one of the tunes that Tom used to play on his Radio Caroline South days. Carl England is a name that's been mentioned several times because that is a name that was recalled by Mark Dean. He has contacted us via Paul Roelly saying that he was under another name, Malcolm, aged about 57. Let me put you all straight on this one. Mark helped with the original Caroline Road show North for about a year. Now, Mark did say that, and that's what he did after coming off the boat, but he drove the van and moved equipment. This was a show that was taken to court in 1976. Mark's a good-hearted guy who did lots of charity works, but unfortunately is a total dreamer. I intend to contact him and complain bitterly. I worked this road show from almost the beginning to its final end. It was a great tribute to Caroline North. I must admit that I have met many a person claiming to have worked on Caroline, but with very poor knowledge of the stations. Also people claiming to be well-remembered DJs. Why do people do this? Well, perhaps one man who can answer that or help us understand why is Phil Tyson, who's a psychologist based in Manchester, specialises in men's mental welfare. Phil, good evening.
Good evening. I'm just thinking that's a tall ask for me.
Just explain that then, in a nutshell, Phil. You've got 2 minutes.
In a nutshell, I'm not sure I can, but what I'm kind of like seeing here, or well, hearing here, I've been listening to this over the last 20 minutes or so, is just a sense of indignation that you're all feeling, that this guy tried to have you. But also I'm kind of like seeing in him a kind of tragedy, really.
Yeah.
And in some ways, I mean, maybe this is a psychologist in me, but my heart's kind of going out to him, really. Why would somebody need to do that in order to, I don't know, get a little bit of attention, a little bit of notoriety? I mean, I think from the point of view of why people do things like that, I think we all lie to ourselves a little bit. And it's perfectly normal. I mean, I remember coming across one study which looked at men and how attractive they felt they were. And men tend to lie about how attractive they are to themselves. So if you rate yourself a 9 out of 10, you're probably a 7 out of 10, really. I'm sorry, chaps.
It's quite interesting. We're talking about image a little bit later on, Phil, but that is quite... Do you think he believes his own lies?
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, this is what tends to happen with people. When I work with people in my practice, people kind of like develop a little bubble of mistruth sometimes that they kind of then move into and inhabit. And you know, if that's not tallying with reality, it causes them at some level some distress. And one of my roles in some ways is to gently prick that bubble a little bit and allow some of the air to come out.
I think the unusual situation here is that he was confronted head on. I mean, in day-to-day life, do we normally allow folk to get away with telling porkies, really?
Well, I think in day-to-day life we really rely on, and we've got to assume that people are essentially trustworthy. You know, so when we get on the bus, we expect that it's a legitimate bus by a driver who's got a legitimate qualification, you know. And we just couldn't live social life without, you know. And then this is why cheats, you know, people who come along and are clearly telling big pokers are a matter of such moral concern to us, you know, because they actually undermine the very fabric of the way in which we live our life.
We have tried getting hold of Mark. I've rung him several times and left messages. How can you second guess how we might be feeling, given... I mean, he didn't flinch. He was utterly adamant he was telling the truth. I mean, let me play you a little bit when, straight after Paul Roelly's call, I mean, I just turned to him and this is what was said. Are you offended? Are you offended now?
No, not at all. I've heard it said before.
How can you not be offended at two journalists, Paul and then myself, casting complete doubt suddenly from me over this story?
Not at all. Doesn't bother me in the slightest at all. Simply because I've had it said before and I've proved my case before.
How have you proved it?
Because I've had the evidence there.
What evidence?
Years ago.
What evidence, Mark?
Pictures, not just pictures of the ship, because anybody could get them from anywhere. Pictures of me sat in the studio, broadcasting. But I will get those pictures. I will find them.
Are they quite easy to get hold of?
I would imagine so.
I mean, Phil Tyson, he didn't flinch, he didn't blush. I mean, listening carefully there, his speech did alter ever so slightly. Yeah,
he's clearly under stress. I mean, what I would say there is this is somebody from the evidence that you came from you dripped in 5 minutes or so ago, is that this guy, even in the days of the Caroline Radio, the Road Show, he was known as a fantasist then, you know. So this is a guy who's had many years of peddling his mistruths and dealing with other people challenging them. So it doesn't surprise me at all that he's got a really thick skin.
Yeah. Oh, the other question I've been asking tonight, just of everybody, Phil, is the most elaborate lies that people have been told. Oh, so Liz has just texted in 81333. She says the most elaborate lie I've ever been told is "I love you." That's quite sad.
And unfortunately, it's quite common, really. That's awful, isn't it?
Yeah. Well, look, Phil Tyson, good to speak to you.
Okay, nice to be here.
Thanks for your reflections on that. Good of you to join us. Phil Tyson there, Manchester-based psychologist specialising in men's mental welfare. I'm sure you'll hear from Phil again on The Late Show. Others of you have been texting in. Grego says, I work with a guy who claimed one night he was abducted by aliens. And to Anna says, I'm the next Bond girl, but I don't know who gave me the job. On the emails, Marguerite in Chester, now she heard the programme as it happened on Thursday night and just went, blimey, I was hobbling to my bed when all it kicked off. I haven't had so much excitement in years. I have to say, having listened to Radio Caroline North, the name Mark Dean didn't mean a thing. It did to others though, Marguerite. Implanted memories. How interesting is that? But then Marguerite adds another email tonight. Alison.Butterworth at bbc.co.uk says, I take it he hasn't been in with his snaps.
Hi, I'm Steve Royal from Saturday Mornings and a regular voice here on BBC Radio Lancashire. I love this county because of the people and most importantly because of the family and the house I have here in Lancashire. Yes, thank you Lancashire for providing me with a happy home.
At the heart of Lancashire life.
BBC Radio Lancashire.
Hello, good afternoon. It's Mark Dean on Radio Caroline East. It's the Mark Dean Show with Mark Dean. From the good ship, the MV Lollipop, this is Mark Dean, sitting in for Baby Bob Stewart, whoever that guy is.
Lovely.
Coming up at 3 this afternoon is the Micah Hearn Show with Micah Hearn. Micah Hearn on the Micah Hearn Show on Radio Caroline East with Micah Hearn.
Wonderful Radio London. Whoopee.
Or it might be Tom Lodge. Right now you're with Duffy Mark Dean.
Piccadilly. First with Piccadilly.
Here's a singer I once interviewed, then interviewed again, and then again, and then another time after that. And there may have been some more after that. A wonderful lady, Jean Pitney. I interviewed her, you know.
It hurts to be in love when the only one you love turns out to be someone who's not in love with you. It hurts to be in love night and day and night. It hurts to be in love.
Sounding good on your major mega market marvellous marine station, Radio Caroline East with Mark Dean on 539 metres Dateline, December the 39th, 1857 with Mark Dean. The best music with Mark Dean, Mark Dean. Dean, Mark.
Caroline, land of the nation. Caroline, the sound of the land. Caroline, the sound of the nation. Caroline.
Mark Dean. This is Micah Hearn's Caroline Sure Shot from Fatboy Slim. It's so new, it will not be released until the next century. A great choice, mate, from Micah Hearn, Michael A. Hearn. That's Micah Hearn with some help from Tom Lodge. I'm Mark Dean the Surf.
Right about now, the Funk Soul Brother. Check it out now. The Funk Soul Brother. Right about now.
Up next on the Watery Wireless is Alva Liddell, Billy Cotton, Lord Reith, Lord Kitchener, Freeman Hardy and Willis, Fortnum and Mason, J. Arthur Rank, Judith Chalmers, the Dagenham Girl Pipers, McDougall's Flower and Wonderlove, Dave D, Dozy, Beaky Mick and Titch, Captain Scarlet and the Mysterons, and Alison Butterworth. Brought to you by today's sponsor, Micah Hearn. Keep it Caroline.
If you